We're going to move straight on to energy now. We've discussed technology. We've discussed the big geopolitical patterns, but the rise of renewables and clean energies and how that fits into the Middle East and Asia, or the Middle East pivot to Asia. I'll invite my guests now to come up. Mike Muller, who's Chief Business Development Officer at Vitol. Jamie Balmer, Strategy and Implementation Director at Wood. And Rob McNabb, Partner, Construction and Engineering, Renewable Energies at Eversheds, Sutherland. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Look, we've heard earlier about Middle East economies attempting to diversify. We've heard about demand in Asia for energy. Asia or parts of Asia are leading the way in some clean tech and renewable energy technology. Is this a perfect storm for even closer relationships between the Middle East and Asia, or is it in fact present a challenge because of the differing pace of demands for energy?
Well, first of all, is mine.
You're on? Yeah.
Yep. First of all, thanks very much for having us here today.
Good.
Real pleasure and an honour. I would see it as a kind of win-win for each region. First of all, I mean, if you look at what our customers, Wood's main customers in the oil and gas space in the region, the NOCs, and they are clearly diversifying into downstream markets very heavily with well-publicised partnerships with China and the India region. And this is because that's where if they're looking at the energy transition, they're seeing that as their main future growth areas. And then the other side of the coin, there's huge potential for renewables in the Middle East. And of course, China has been one of the main drivers of bringing the cost of renewables down, whether it's mainly in the supply chain space and new technologies. They've been driving down the cost of solar cells, for example. So on both sides of the coin, it seems like a very opportune trade arrangement between both regions.
Yeah. Rob, would you agree that this is, the circumstances are such that this can actually be a huge opportunity for both regions?
Yes, without question. I think, and I see it really coming under three kind of pillars. The first is the export opportunity for product from Asia into the Middle East. I mean, there's a huge growth within the Middle East in terms of renewables, and the scale of those projects is ever increasing. The price of those projects is coming down, which all points to the fact that there being a lot more projects, beg your pardon. And with solar in particular, 60% of the world's solar panels are made in China. And of the projects within the Middle East, it's way higher than that in terms of where the product is sourced from. So there's a huge opportunity for product from Asia into the Middle East. I think there's opportunity for investment from Asia into the Middle East, and we've seen that really since the start of the Middle Eastern market. A number of the first round of projects in Jordan, a number of the Egyptian projects have all involved Asian money. What I think we're now seeing increasingly is actually Middle Eastern money going into Asian projects, particularly in the Islamic countries where there's an Islamic finance model being utilised. So Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh in particular. We're seeing money now beginning to flow in the other direction in terms of investment, equity and debt into those projects. So I see those as the three kind of subsets of the potential opportunity.
Right. Mike, in terms of, oil prices up, tensions in the Gulf, good for oil companies, no question about it, but also could accelerate the energy transition, could it not?
Absolutely. And where to start? The Middle East and energy, we could be here all day. Yes, indeed. You say prices are high. Indeed, many experts in oil markets are confused why oil prices are not higher, given what's been going on in the Middle East of late. And let's just talk about those attacks in the Gulf of Oman of late, for example, and the escalating tensions with Iran and the US rhetoric. This is one unfortunate action away from conflict, as many people are saying. There was a conference in Kuala Lumpur just last week, the AOGC Asian Oil and Gas Conference, where many admired and respected commentators said this is really, really a very short fuse that is alight at the moment. And yes, coming on to renewables now, clearly the higher the oil price, the more money there is to stimulate alternative investments. But the Middle East and Asia are probably at the back of the queue in people's view in terms of the energy transition, going green, adopting renewables, for the very simple reason they have abundant energy, it is cheap, and there is less pressure, be it from activist investors, and certainly from the population at large in Asia as a whole, and we're talking more than half the world's population here, to go green. That said, countries like China are right at the forefront of developments in terms of making the most solar panels, making the most wind farms, most of them in the world actually, and having the best penetration of electric vehicles in inner cities and doing something about pollution. And they have to. Anybody who's been to a Chinese city will know what I'm talking about. So there's a bit of both. But the Middle East, which is our theme, I guess, are really making headlines. I mean, everyone probably knows that records are being set every time there is a public tender for solar energy deployment. And whether you want to talk of dollars per megawatt hour or cents per kilowatt hour, we're talking at or around 2 cents per kilowatt hour or $20 per megawatt hour. Those are really, really competitive numbers which render coal completely obsolete.
Yes.
And of course, we all know it's pretty sunny in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So, I guess I'll stop there.
No, that's very interesting. The cost of not only the technology but also the energy produced, quite phenomenal. Jamie, in China, a lot of it's being driven not by climate change concerns or not by energy cost concerns, but by pollution. Hence the electric cars, hence the investment in it. Again, is this going to continue to be the main driver for this energy transition, or are other things like climate change, which remains at the forefront of international headlines and global debate, going to drive it further?
That's an interesting question, because I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that, the answer to that. I don't think you could say definitively that activism against pollution will definitely drive the energy transition. However, I would say it's quite likely to play a big part. We've actually just at Wood recently I've been running a scenario planning exercise, and one of the scenarios that came out of that, it's still in development, is the idea that the energy transition be accelerated by social action against pollution and the effects on children or human health in general. So yeah, I think it's going to increasingly be a driving force, and it's got a lot of potential to be a driving force in the developing world in particular, because of the extremely low quality air in a lot of the big super cities that are growing up throughout the region. But really, for me, how fast one of the key factors in how fast the energy transition moves forward is public policy. So that's going to be the thing that really pushes things, and that's where the pollution question drives into the whole how the whole energy transition moves forward.
Yeah, let's stick with that sort of broad theme of energy transition. Do you see it accelerating? You talk about some fantastic investment opportunities. You talk about flows going both ways. You talk about Islamic Finance playing a role in this. But there is the political question, the policy question, and the social question. Are these drivers of that transition?
To date, primarily, but I think the scale of that is tailing off, and I'll come on to that in a moment. I mean, most of the big clean energy projects in both regions to date have been primarily driven by government tenders.
Yep.
And so you are therefore reliant on government policy to drive the tender to make the projects happen. Yeah. And there have been countries where that has been successful, Jordan, Egypt. There have been countries where it has taken a bit longer. But so yes, today the government policy has been a very significant factor. But what we're beginning to see now, and I think this in part plays into your last question, is there's huge pressure globally on global corporates to become carbon neutral. Yes. You've got the RE100, where all these companies are striving to be carbon neutral, essentially for PR issues as much as anything, and they're struggling to do that just within the confines of their own energy usage. What they're now doing is they're looking at their supply chain for them to reduce their carbon footprint, for them to reduce their carbon footprint, and therefore they're looking to their manufacturing subcontractors to become more clean energy friendly. And so I think for the Asia region in particular, there is huge opportunities for factories and these sorts of facilities to put kind of what we call private PPA arrangements in place, where they are actually have their own private generation from renewable energy sources in order to satisfy the requirements of their own customers, i.e. these large global corporates. So we're seeing a big shift now towards the private PPA market, and I think there are huge opportunities in that respect in the Asia region in particular because of how much global manufacturing comes from there. And so there is a bit of a less of a reliance on government policy for those sorts of projects, albeit you still need to have the right regulatory regime in place to be able to do it. But there is that kind of shift now towards private projects as opposed to governmental.
I mean, that's quite a significant shift, though, isn't it? Because that will potentially unlock much more capital, and as you say, the pressure on companies to go green through social and investor activism. The oil companies, how are they positioning themselves in this time of energy transition, growing social pressure, political pressure to...
It's a fascinating question. I worked at Shell until a year ago, so a year and a half ago. So Shell is very much preoccupied. Every single conference you go to, they will choose to have this chief executive speak about energy transition rather than the economics of drilling for deep water prospects in
we've had
Brazil.
Doing the same.
Yes. And it is really not just activist investor pressure. There is a sense of duty that governments need help, and that leading the way will pay dividend in the long run, because those people that choose to invest in oil companies, largely for the dividend flow, will walk with their feet and will go with others. Now, in the oil sector, the business of extracting oil is not quite as simple as some people sometimes assume. Only a few companies have the proprietary technology to be competitive in extracting hard-to-reach assets, whether it's in deep water offshore, West Africa, Brazil, whether it's in the shale, fracking, etc. And as a consequence, there has to be a very delicate balance struck between not abandoning the very activity that's going to keep the planet running.
Yes.
Everyone accepts that global affluence, growth, and a lot of countries still need to get up that GDP curve, as well as conveniences of modern life require us to stay with fossil fuels.
Yes.
But these oil majors are all saying the same thing, well, for the most part anyway, that there needs to be a certain portion of the activity, of the deployment of risk capital, of investment, into renewable energies. And we're talking billions off of 30 billion a year, perhaps, type capex. So we're still talking single digit, maybe 10% of total outlay on things like battery technologies. And there's a cognizance that most of this renewable business is cyclical and likely to be a losing bet, because you invest in a company today that might not be around 5 years from now. That history tells you that. So investing in generation of renewable energy, solar, wind, utilities, power generation, batteries, all doesn't look like the same lucrative double-digit plus return that drilling for oil and gas will get you. And yet, the majors are doing it because they feel they have to. They feel it is the right thing morally, not just because the Norwegian state oil fund, pension fund, is going to walk with their feet, but because they want to remain relevant and they want to be investment of first choice in that sector.
Yeah, I mean, the population growth and the economic growth of the region in Asia, that's playing a big role here, isn't it? Because the Middle East, young population, want to diversify their economies, want to grow their economies, and there's therefore a demand for fuel. They still need exports of fossil fuel to fund that growth, to fund that economy and that population. But at the same time, in the Middle East, they have fantastic opportunities for renewables. Again, in a sense, this opens up the way, the growing demand for energy at a time when there is technology capable of being applied to the Middle East, is likely to focus policy much more on renewables than ever before, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's I guess there's two sides to that. There's the population growth in the Middle East, and then, of course, the population growth in Asia, which is going to be the main catalyst for future opportunities in energy in general when it comes to oil and gas. If we focus on the Middle East, as it's well known, they've got a really high population growth rate, one of the highest in the world. For some of the individual countries in the Middle East, it is the highest in the world. And what you've seen in reaction, I would argue, in reaction to the the oil crash in 2014, it's almost pushed governments and companies to bring forward new strategic actions. So like I touched on earlier, the kind of shift into downstream, but more significantly in relation to your question is the big push towards developing indigenous gas assets. And the reason for that is because the energy demand growth in the Middle East, because of the population growth, because of the explosion in diversification, is exceeding the ability of governments, even like Saudi Arabia, to kind of meet that demand. And they want to move away from oil-fired power generation in particular. So that, for me, creates a huge opportunity for renewables, because at the moment, companies like Saudi Aramco and ADNOC are scrabbling to develop unconventionals, to develop, to suck out any gas they can from the system to meet increasing power demand. And at the same time, you've got this huge solar potential. You've even got huge potential for wind in the Middle East because of the wind patterns, etc. So, yeah, it's key, undeniably.
Is solar the number one opportunity, do you believe? In terms of renewables?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the percentage of deployment to date, it's very heavily weighted towards solar. And I think there is a particular advantage with solar in the Middle East. If you look at the daily power curve for most Middle Eastern countries, there is a spike in demand during the course of the day while you have air cooling and manufacturing, all the sort going on. And obviously that corresponds very nicely with the power curve generation from a solar plant. So, there is a synergy between solar and the power curve in the Middle East that you wouldn't quite have in the same way with wind. That said, in certain Middle Eastern countries, you have onshore wind conditions that are analogous to offshore wind conditions. So there are geographical factors that the west of the Nile in Egypt has by reputation the best onshore wind conditions globally. So that there are, I think, there is the potential for wind there still, but certainly the market to date has been dominated by solar, and I think probably will, but perhaps not by the same extent for the foreseeable. Yeah.
Okay, we'll open up now for questions. Please just put your hand there. We'll bring you around a microphone. The gentleman there, please.
Hi, thank you. James Petretta from IHS Market. One thing, I have a question related to what Jamie, I think you were just commenting on. One thing I think we haven't really covered today is the issue of jobs. We've talked about tech and kind of opportunity there that sometimes can lead to the elimination of some traditional jobs. And population growth. I'm thinking now about Saudi especially. Could the panel maybe comment on the potential for development of renewables in relation to potential domestic job growth, hiring locals, developing local talent, as opposed to hiring foreign talent for that? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yes. So I think it's a broader question. It's just like everything else. The Middle East has got huge potential in terms of its young population, because there's a huge demographic bubble. It's probably got the same challenges in renewables that you face in oil and gas. So there's quite a small pool of, say it's like engineers, for example, or specialists in other technologies. So the challenge for companies like Wood and other companies, whether it's in the renewable space or in oil and gas, is how to attract and retain that talent. And I think it's related to the Saudi Vision 2030 and the other vision statements throughout the region. The main tenets of all of these is to increase job opportunities. So, my final statement on this would be there's definitely opportunity there, and from my experience, it's a lot of interest in renewable technologies and opportunities in renewables. I live in Dubai, I'm based in Abu Dhabi, and you can see the interest from young people in the region, but there are challenges getting to the point where there are enough of them that you can sustain all of the projects and the work you've got to do in that space just using indigenous talent.
Welcome,
But it
both of you.
might be 10 or 15 years before you get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, sorry.
No, please.
Just, yeah, I mean, to add to that, we speak to a lot of governments around at the start of their tender process on projects when they're beginning to engage on a clean energy program. And they have a bit of a decision to make in terms of, do they want to deploy projects quickly and get the lowest possible price for the power, which leans you more towards buying in engineering capability and so on, and not establishing manufacturing in country, or do they want to grow local jobs and get local content as high as possible? And there's that slight conflict between which route do they want to go down, more price and speed or more generation of employment. And where most of the projects tend to end up, certainly for the early rounds, is around a 30% requirement for local employment in terms of the value of the project. And it's normally sized at that because that is normally the value of the project that you would attribute to the build cost, as opposed to the cost of the panels or the wind turbines or whatever it may be. So as a statutory requirement, it normally lands at about 30% requirement for local content. But you are seeing some countries that are moving to increase that in order to push up local manufacturing. So Saudi, for example, is talking about going as high as 70% in terms of local content. The downside to that is that you need to give surety that there's a pipeline in order to get the manufacturers to set up in a particular country. And that's the bit where there is still some nervousness. So in terms of for local contracting, building the roads, building the infrastructure, that generally is done locally. In terms of the product supply, there's a decision to be made as to whether that's your prime focus, and where it is. The area where I think governments aren't quite getting as much as they can at the moment is because they're not giving the surety of the pipeline to encourage people to invest and set up the manufacturing facilities.
So
I'll be very quick, Michael. Obviously, the population time bomb is critical for social stability in many Middle Eastern countries, and we all too often focus on Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Emirates, when there's much more population in countries that really need jobs. But energy is not indirectly going to create jobs, and renewable energy certainly, for reasons already stated. It is the knock-on benefits, it's the secondary processes that come through there. So if you look at natural gas, which you haven't spoken about much yet, that can give rise to petrochemical developments, which is very job intensive. But then again, what sort of jobs are you creating? In Abu Dhabi, invariably, you put up a petrochemical plant, it'll be full of migrant workers from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. So is that the sort of job you want to create, sucking in migrant labor? Or do you want to create jobs in the service sector that appeals more to the nationals in the region? I would suggest it's the latter. So let's not ignore the effect of cheap energy, which includes solar, on desalination. Desalination can give rise to all sorts of things, whether it's agriculture, whether it's tourism, and all the growth. And just look at Dubai.
So it's the knock-on effects of the cheaper energy and the...
Desalination is a big lever. Yep.
Okay.
Sorry.
Excellent. No, good. Thank you very much. We've got one there and then the lady there, please.
We're still seeing the oil demand rise going up, oil demand growth going up, and companies like Vitol still trading more oil, and there's a lot more downstream projects happening. So I just wanted to ask the question, when do you think we're going to see the renewables really demand outstripping that for oil?
Renewables with demand outstripping oil, well, partly depends.
Would you like a global answer or a Middle Eastern answer?
Yeah. Both. Give us both.
I have some figures with me. So global energy demand for renewables has overtaken the third biggest energy source globally, which is hydro, believe it or not, right? So it's left nuclear and oil behind long time ago in terms of power generation, right? So we're talking about 1.4 terawatts. Gas is at 1.6 and coal is at 1.8. So it's close to chasing the number 2 position, which is occupied by gas and then coal. But that's still only about a quarter of total power generation demand from renewables. That's global. Yes. In the Middle East, of course, it's way behind. We mentioned the oil burn in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudi stated 2030 strategy is to stop burning hydrocarbons for energy and putting them all into refining and then ultimately into petrochemicals. So turning the resource in the ground into advanced petrochemicals, plastics, etc., and going down that renewables path. That's the stated objective. But is Saudi the place you do it first for economic reasons? If your power stations are in the center of the country where the oil is, so you have to double handle the oil out and get something back in from the coast, it's obviously not the way to go.
Yeah. So when will the renewables demand overtake hydrocarbon?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd be a really rich man, I think, or certainly in the future. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about when that will happen, obviously. I think if you look at transport the transport bit of the pie for oil demand, I think that's where you're going to see the answer for that. And then that's about uptake of electric vehicles, etc. So what, I mean, off the top of my head, I think it's about 40% of oil demand goes to transport at the moment. That's going to be the biggest hit part, probably, from the energy transition. And then the other side of it is stuff like how much efficiency are we going to see from end users? How much carbon capture and storage are we going to see? Because that will keep the ability for, let's say, in an aggressive energy transition scenario, that will keep the ability of oil producers to keep servicing the market if they're. But of course, on all of those issues, and there's lots more I could go into, obviously, but on all of those issues, we're not seeing tremendous progress across all markets. And you touched on, it depends what region you're in.
Yeah.
Look at the uptake of electric vehicles in Norway. If that's the future quite rapidly, then we're going to see a big cut in oil demand from transportation within the next 15, 20 years. But the world average is more like, it's all under 2%. And we're seeing a slight uptick at the moment, but it just shows what the uncertainty is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can add much further than that, to be honest.
Okay, just behind you. Oh, just there. And then we'll come to you.
You mentioned Islamic Finance and sort of financing the developments and the projects, but have you noticed a decrease in the availability of Islamic Finance products, especially from conventional sort of Western banks? And are you seeing more of an uptake from local, sort of the Malaysian banks or the Singaporean banks?
In terms of the projects, I mean, if I look at what's on the desk at the moment, so to speak, it is into each of the countries I mentioned, so Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Malaysia, it is all what I would call fairly conventional Islamic finance models, primarily with through the regional Middle Eastern finance entities.
Okay, just there, please. Mike's on his way.
Shenkaji from Wood. Clearly, when we talk about energy transition in the Middle East, we all see the country like Saudi and the UAE, they are actually changing from the black to green energies. Saudi particularly, for example, they are doing lots of things, not only in renewables, but also civil nuclear programs. Yeah. They make their commitment to 2030, they are going to build 16 nuclear reactors. UAE is another country, they have already done that. They have now got 4 nuclear reactors in country run to supply their power generation. And then if we look at the general social and economic impact, the nuclear program ticked the box, including the creating local jobs, input local content, etc., much more deep and rich than renewables. So my observation, it is a question to the panel that when we look at renewable sector, we now understand China is the largest renewable component provider, and also they are doing largest renewable program globally. So how we, from UK, see the impact from China go to the Middle East, taking the role in their energy transition. And then the second challenge I want to ask is, in the nuclear program, for example, we all understand UK is the first labor market economy for nuclear market, and which is very successful, can bring private money into nuclear programs, which is the first time in history. Can we see in the future in the Middle East that there are more local private investment go to the civil nuclear sector, either big power reactor or small modular reactor, which is only need a couple of £billion to build a program? So that's the two comments. One is how we seen the challenge from China, access to those markets. We possibly have to compete or working with them. Then the other one is how we can see the future for the civil nuclear program in the Middle East, which is important for the energy mix, which is important to their green journey. Therefore, how the private money can impact to that program.
Okay, let's start with you, Jamie.
Thanks, Shenki. So on the second point, I'll start with that one. Without having my wood hat on, I would see, objectively, that you would probably see, you've seen a kind of decline in the West from interest in renewables. Maybe interest in nuclear is the wrong word, but there's been a kind of decline, whereas the future of nuclear in China is very optimistic. You're going to see big growth rates going forward. And when I look at the Middle East and the potential demand for nuclear in the medium to long term, it would seem logical that space might be filled with technologies and inputs from China, maybe places like Russia as well, anywhere that holds that kind of indigenous patent for nuclear technology that they're willing to sell. And I think it's going to be a big challenge for UK companies because of the background noise that we're seeing at the moment around kind of trade disputes, just a general, I guess there's almost that feeling that we're kind of building up to some sort of, low-level confrontation, which maybe is getting in the way of what could be better collaboration between the UK, for example, and China. I'm not an expert in nuclear, but I think that probably didn't help with Hinkley C and what happened there. So that would be my observation. Did that cover the first point as well?
Yeah. Let's take the nuclear question, though. I mean, there's clearly a program, very ambitious, very optimistic program in China. Does that translate to the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, China's obviously an investor into Hinkley Point. I think the difficulty with nuclear is just the cost. When we talked earlier on about it being, 20 megawatts an hour, prices coming in for solar in the Middle East now, and that's on a 12 to 15-year PPA. Hinkley Point's £45 an hour on a 30-year PPA, so it's more than twice the price. So politically, it's quite difficult, I think, to justify a nuclear project purely because the cost of energy for your population is going to be that much higher. Either the government subsidises that in some way, or the consumers bear that cost. So I think there is that challenge around nuclear. But that said, you can, as you say, employ a lot of people, and you can get a lot of gigawatts from those projects. But certainly in terms of a lot of the large utilities and investors that we act for and speak to, I feel generally there is also a bit of a shift away from mega generation projects to more smart grid, more localized generation assets. Clearly there are exceptions to that, but I think the global market is more of a shift away from whatever the technology, these huge power plants, because of what we can now do from a smart grid point of view in terms of localized supply. So I'm slightly cynical about nuclear for those regions and probably remain so, to be honest.
Cynical about nuclear?
Look, very simply, nuclear will create lots of security jobs. It scares me nothing scares me more than the prospect of missiles being lobbed at ships and being lobbed at facilities and nuclear plants going up. That said, many of these nations have the prerogative and the geopolitical clout and desire and right to have nuclear power. There's no debate that it's not economic anymore. It's been left behind by more competitive industries, as you've already said.
So the economic drivers actually might reduce the demand for...
Should do.
Yeah, okay. Time for one final question. So over there, please.
Ranjiv Gunawardena. I would like to find out from Vitol, in terms of oil and gas activities, do you predominantly favor onshore or offshore? And in terms of financing these transactions, would you actually look at Islamic finance as an alternative way of doing things or not? Or it's a bit too early for you?
I thought we dodged the Islamic finance.
No, we'll come back.
Come back to Sukuks and everything. Okay, onshore, offshore, do you mean financing or do you mean projects? Okay. The vast majority of financing needs are in places where one scrambles and there is a finite appetite for such financing. So we're talking about things like energy developments in Africa, Middle East, Asia, South America, and parts of the former the CIS. On the margin, a blend of both tends to be the successful route that we go. Vitol, as a company, has given financial backing or enabled finance to be raised for the development of gas projects, integrated infrastructure projects, and oil developments as well, where others have come to us and said, please, can you arrange? But the driver for a company like my company is that we're a trading business. We can add value to the supply chain by integrating the offtake or the supply to a respective asset that we're helping finance with our global trading infrastructure, which is something other companies can do as well, of course. And that is what brings us to the table. So we therefore don't put much of our own money in the game, but we will act as facilitators, ringleaders to bring financiers offshore and onshore together. And I guess this is the most pronounced in West Africa in particular, where onshore lending capacity is simply not enough to get behind the projects that need to be financed. So I will confess I'm not a huge expert on Islamic financing. I've done some reading up on Sukuks and the needs for that. So I can't give you an answer on what my company is doing, and please blame the fact that I've only been there 1 year. Perhaps another panelist.
I was going to say, but Rob, Islamic financing clearly is on the rise. I mean, we've talked about it a lot here as part of the Middle East program, but also in Southeast Asia, and it's being it's somehow being lumped in with green investing. Is that one sort of very blunt take on it?
Yeah, because I think, well, it's a tier of the different sources of financing that are available, and it has worked well, or is being the preferred source of finance for certain projects in Islamic countries where you have Islamic Asian countries where you have money coming from Islamic Middle Eastern countries.
Yes.
I mean, I think if you look at renewables projects in the Middle East, certainly the non-GCC Middle East countries and other Asian countries, the DFIs still provide a very significant portion of the finance. So IFC and EBRD and so on. So there's still a lot of the money.
Yes.
Is still coming from DFIs and the various sorts of models. And then export credit agencies, I think, are then probably the other main source of finance. They're talking about renewables in those regions for those sorts of projects.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Look, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We're out of time. Great area to look at. I mean, fascinating because it ties up technology. It ties up the link between the Middle East and Asia. Geopolitics, troubles in the Gulf, oil prices. What's the oil price going to be?
Gosh, please don't put me on the spot. The forward curve tells us that the price is going to go from high 60s to low 60s unless something changes. But that's the beauty of oil markets.
Something could change.
Headlines all the time.
Yeah. So clearly a lot of activity in this place. Please join me in thanking my speakers today. Mike, Rob, Jamie, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all very much for being here. Please join us for a drink, some lunch, sandwich, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.